Okay, we're recording. I have recorded those of you who are here, and I'll get the rest of you from the Zoom participation list. Remember, your exam is next Tuesday. Let's see, I believe we started chapter 8 is where it would start. And we covered chapter 8, chapter 9. We're going to finish chapter 10 today. I hope we get into chapter 11 today, but I won't. We're certainly not going to cover all of it. So as far as the exam, only anything we cover from chapter 11 in class today. That's all that will be on the this exam. And then so the vast majority of chapter 11 will be on the third exam. Chapter 11 is a very important chapter. So we will be spending a good bit of time on it. And the sapling for chapter 11, you will have until the third exam to do that. Also remember that you can use a 3x5 inch note card on the exam. Right? Any questions? Yes.
I'll ask you at the end of the class because it had to do with the stuff I just missed.
Okay. 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 We have been talking about externalities, and I think the chapter, the title is very appropriate when the price is not right. We've emphasized the vital role that prices play in determining how resources will be used. Prices communicate information, they create incentives, they coordinate the actions of the consumers with the actions of the producers. They do all these great things. And when you don't have externalities, you get that outcome that we've talked about before. You know, if there are no externalities and you have a free market, then you got the demand curve. Remember what the demand curve shows you. It shows you how much consumers want at each price, but it also shows you the value consumers place on each extra unit. So if the fifth unit here, the price is $50, then we said that means that fifth unit is worth $50 to some consumer, and the value of the sixth unit is going to be a little bit less, the seventh a little bit less. So we can interpret the demand curve as a marginal benefit curve or as a private value curve. It's telling us what each unit is worth to a consumer. And the supply curve, not only does it tell us how many units will be supplied at each price, it also shows us the cost to producers of producing each unit. For that fifth unit, if the point here is $10, then we said we can interpret that as meaning the cost to a producer of producing that fifth unit is $10. And the sixth unit is going to be a little bit more, seventh a little bit more. For every unit of output, we can read up to the supply curve, and that gives us the cost. So in a free market with no externalities, we could say market forces are going to push us to the equilibrium where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded, and that's a good thing. But we said also, if you look at that very last unit, the I'm going to call it the marginal benefit, or the value of that very last unit is equal to the marginal cost. of that last unit. So if we're in equilibrium, let's say the equilibrium price is $20, then, and let's say that this is 200 units, then we can look at that and say, if there are no externalities, this is exactly where we want to be, because that last unit, reading off the demand curve, it's worth $20 to a consumer. And reading off the supply curve, that last unit costs $20 to produce. So that very last unit is just barely worth what it costs. Really kind of indifferent between producing that last unit and not producing. But on all of these previous units, each unit was worth more to the consumer than it cost the producer to produce. So there was a gain from the production of all of these first units. So we want all of those produced. We don't want any of these produced because all of those would have a cost from the supply curve that would exceed the benefit to the consumer. And so there would be a welfare loss. We don't want any of these produced. We want all of these produced. So we want to be at 200. That's exactly where the market forces take us. And so that was a great conclusion. We don't have to have anybody in charge. Everybody can just do what's best for them, and we get to this really nice outcome. The market equilibrium, the equilibrium quantity, was also the efficient quantity. Okay? It was the quantity that we would want if we want to use our resources as efficiently as possible. But when we introduced the externalities, then we saw that we don't get that nice outcome. Okay? When we were talking about this production of tires, say the equilibrium price is $200, we're assuming that the tire producers are a byproduct of their production is some kind of toxic chemical they're putting it into the air or into the water, and that imposes cost on people in the community. That's a very real cost, but it is an external cost. It's not a private cost because it is not borne by the producer and it's not borne by the consumer. So here we're going to have an inefficient use of resources because the prices that exist, the prices people are trading at, do not take into account all of the cost of their actions. The last tire produced here, it's worth $200 to the consumer. There's a cost to the producer. There's a cost to the producer of $200, but you've got the rest of the community who's being harmed by this. They're bearing a cost of $150, and nobody's taking that into account. A resource is being used, the environment. There's a cost of using the environment to dispose of chemicals, but nobody is taking that into account. That's the essence of why you get a bad outcome. And so we started seeing last time that with this externality, the equilibrium is still here, but that is no longer the efficient outcome or the efficient quantity, because the efficient quantity is always where the marginal social benefit is equal to the marginal social cost. Or in other words, taking all of the benefits into account and all the cost into account, you want to stop at the quantity where that last unit produces benefits in total, which are equal to the cost in total. And so we said that if we still have the supply curve, which shows the private cost, but then we have the external cost that we're adding in. It's same effect as back in chapter 6 when we imposed a tax. It would shift the curve up. So you get this new curve here, which is showing the social cost. It's including all, when we say social, we just mean including all of the costs borne privately and the external cost. So for every point on the supply curve, you just move that up by the amount of the externality. So that gives us, whereas this point was, let's say it's 400. This point was $400 and $200. The benefit of that last tire is $200, but the cost, taking everything into account, is $350. Obviously, it's not a good idea to produce that last tire since the cost exceeds the benefit. The problem is the producer has an incentive to produce it, and the consumer has an incentive to buy it because the $200 price is not reflecting the true cost of producing that tire. And the efficient outcome would be here, because, and let's say that's 300. And let's put in a couple of numbers. Let's say the point here is 150. And the point here is 300. So we would say that 300 is the efficient quantity because that last tire being produced, what's it worth to a consumer? Not to a consumer. The last tire, reading off of the demand curve, that last tire is worth $300 to the consumer. And what's the cost of producing that last tire?
That's
No.
the 200.
The private cost of producing that 300 tire would be $150. Okay. The producer bears the cost of $150 when he produces that tire. But then the community bears an additional $150. So the total cost of producing that last tire is $300. The benefit from that last tire is $300. So the efficient outcome would be to produce $300 and for the price to be $300 per tire. Okay? The problem is, apart from government, nobody has an incentive for that to happen, because if government doesn't do anything, the producers say, our cost is only $150 to produce another tire, so we're going to keep producing more, and you end up in the market equilibrium at 400, which involves overproduction, because you're producing these last 100 tires where each one of those is the cost of producing each one is greater than the benefit. Where would the inefficiency, if we have this externality and if government does nothing, where would the inefficiency be represented?
Would it be a little bit further out on the supply side?
Above 400?
Either 400 and outward would be.
No. If government does nothing, we're going to get 400, and the inefficiency is that's too many. That's too many. The essence of the problem is we're producing something where the cost is greater than the benefit. And for all this, all right, for so much of what we do, anytime we talk about inefficiency, it has to do with the fact we're producing something where the cost is greater than the benefit. It's like you go to why don't you go to a restaurant and order your food without looking at the menu? Why not just walk into a restaurant you've never been to before and just say, I'll take this, and this. What's the problem with that? You don't know the prices. And so you may end up buying a steak that's worth $25 to you, but it cost you $50. Any fans of Better Call Saul here? Oh, that's a great show. You should watch that. It's on Netflix. It's an episode where got this guy who's really cocky, and some other people decide to take advantage of him. So they convince him that they are rich but naive. And he's a financial advisor, so he's trying to impress them, and he lets them order the drinks, and they know the most expensive drink, so they order that, and then at the end he sees the menu. Is there something wrong here? No. The reason you look at the menu is so you will know the cost before you buy. Inefficiency is where you are producing something or you're buying something that costs more than it's worth. Okay? And in a market with no externalities, that doesn't happen because everybody has an incentive to look at all the costs and the benefits. But when you have an externality, incentives are wrong. That's the problem. And so if everybody simply follows what they have an incentive to do, you end up here at 400 producing these extra 100 tires where each of those tires cost more than it's worth. And where is the inefficiency measured? Well, think about the 301st tire. 301st tire. What is that tire worth to a consumer? Well, you read up to the demand curve. So it would be worth a little bit less than $300. What is the cost to producing that tire? Let's find that by looking at the social cost curve. So the inefficiency of producing that very next tire is represented there. And then if you look at the 302nd unit, well, the benefit is going to be here. The cost is going to be here. So the inefficiency would be that area. Okay? And you just continue on like that. And we can say that the total benefit to consumers of the last 100 units would be measured by the area under the demand curve. The total cost of those units would be measured by the area under the social cost curve. So clearly, the green area is greater than the blue area. The cost of those units is greater than the benefit, and the difference between those two would be represented by this triangular area. Okay? It's the area below the social cost curve and above the demand curve. And that would be the dead weight loss, or the inefficiency due to overproduction of this good where there are external costs. And I think we see a better graph of that in a second. Yeah, here we go. Because we have an externality, an external cost, the market without government intervention is going to give us overproduction. The efficient quantity would be back here. The equilibrium quantity is going to be here. We get more produced than is efficient. And the measure of the inefficiency is that dead weight loss area. Is there any question now on the problem the inefficiency causes? We haven't talked about what can be done about it. All we've said is that apart from government intervention, it looks like we're going to have a problem here. We're going to see there's one caveat. There's potential that the market could solve the problem. We'll point that out in a second, but generally it's probably not going to happen. Okay. Any question about this? Okay. You have an external cost. The problem is you're going to end up with overproduction. It would be better to have less. When we talk about the efficient quantity, we mean the quantity that maximizes social surplus where the social surplus is the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus plus the surplus that anyone else is getting. And with an externality, it's a negative surplus that others in the community are receiving. Okay. Notice when we talk about efficiency, we're not thinking about who's getting the gain. We're adding all those gains together. So what could be done to try to improve the outcome? One possibility is to have a tax. Okay? Now that may seem strange because if you go back to chapter 6, we said that where we looked at taxes and subsidies, there we said if we impose a tax on something, that creates inefficiency. Okay? Go back to this from chapter 6, okay? Where we said, this is where we didn't have an externality. We said that without the tax, over here, we end up in our equilibrium. Consumer surplus is here, producer surplus is here. Gains from trade would be the total. And so the gains from trade are maximized. We said if we impose a tax, then say we impose it on the producers, when the supply curve shifts, you end up moving up to here, okay? Output goes down, and we said this area is the inefficiency caused by the tax. You know, under normal circumstances, you impose the tax, it reduces output, it causes the price to be wrong. It causes output to go down, it causes the gains from trade to be reduced. But now we're going to see that in a situation where you have a negative externality or an external cost, a tax can actually be beneficial. Tax on a good with an extra cost reduces the deadweight loss and raises revenue. And these are called Pagouvian taxes because they're named after an economist named Pagou. So when you hear Pagouvian tax, it just means a tax on a good that has external cost. Pagouvian tax is an attempt to fix the problem or to make the situation better, reduce the inefficiency. And let's see how that could work. Again, let's assume you got the externality. If government doesn't do anything, we're going to be right here. We're going to have this area that represents the deadweight loss from overproduction. The problem is that the price does not reflect all of the cost of using the resources. It doesn't reflect all the cost of producing this product. Okay? So really the question is, how could we get the price to reflect this cost that's being left out? Okay? And one way to get the producers to recognize the cost is to impose a tax on them. Okay? And if you know exactly the amount of the external cost, this is a solution that would work very, very well. Okay? We're assuming that that the externality, that the external cost is $150 per tire. Okay. So the problem is that the supply curve, the private supply curve, doesn't reflect that $150 cost. So if we know this is the case, easy way to impose a $150 cost on the producer is to say for every unit you produce, you have to pay $150 tax. Okay? Because when you impose a $150 tax on the producer, that means that the supply curve is going to shift up by the amount of the tax. So if the external cost is 150 and you impose a $150 tax, okay, then the tax shifts the supply curve to exactly where we want it to be. And when the supply curve shifts up, then that means that this low price here is no longer, I think that was 200. That's no longer an equilibrium, okay? Because now the supply curve is up here, the demand curve is here. This is not only the efficient outcome, but this is going to be the equilibrium, the market equilibrium. Okay. This is where we are going to be, okay? Simply because when you impose a tax on the producer, then he's now going to take that cost into account. He's not thinking about the externality, but he is taking the tax into account. And since the tax is the same magnitude as the externality, then he is taking everything that's relevant into account. And with the new supply curve, we move to here. And that would mean that the equilibrium output is going to drop back to here. And that is going to be the efficient quantity, the efficient outcome, because now the cost of the last tire is going to equal the benefit to the consumers of the last tire. Okay. Notice when we were describing the inefficiency without any tax, in that situation, we were saying the market is going to be here. We wish we could be here. Okay? This was the equilibrium. Okay? But once we impose this tax, then the actual market supply curve shifts. So our actual equilibrium moves from here up to there. This is now where we're going to be. And so there's no deadweight loss because we no longer have overproduction. So if you have an external cost where the government knows exactly the amount of it, and if the amount is the same for every unit that gets produced, then a Pigouvian tax could work very, very well. Okay? In theory, it solves the problem. Unfortunately, often we don't know exactly the amount of the externality, and it may vary. You know, for the first unit, it may be very small, but then as you produce more and more, the externality may get bigger and bigger. And so that complicates things. Okay, when a tax is imposed on a good with significant external costs, the deadweight loss is what? We got external cost. We now impose a tax. Is that going to increase the deadweight loss, decrease it, or have no effect? Which one?
I say A.
It's going to be B. And reduce it because, think about what we just said. Without the tax, we're going to be here, Without the tax, we're going to be here. Efficiency says we should be here. So without the tax, we're going to have this deadweight loss. The tax causes output to go down, which means those units that shouldn't be produced aren't going to be produced. And so if we can impose exactly the right tax, then we'll be here and we'll have no deadweight loss. So, in theory, Pigouvian taxes can work very, very well. Okay, it's just actually applying it can be rather difficult. But so a tax by itself, generally, we would say it's going to create deadweight loss. But if you have an external cost and you impose the tax, then it can actually reduce the deadweight loss. Okay. Yeah, that's important. All right. The other kind of externality is a positive externality or an external benefit. And that, probably figure out what that would be. That's where you have a transaction between two parties and somebody else is going to benefit from that transaction.
So kind of like the flu shot.
That's going to be our example. That when you get, well, let's see, and yeah, example here, vaccines benefit the person who is vaccinated, okay, but they also create an external benefit because if you've been vaccinated, you're less likely to spread the disease to somebody else. In fact, if everybody else gets vaccinated, well, you don't have to get vaccinated because what they have done has been very beneficial for you. The problem is the person who gets the shot bears all the cost. You have to pay for it. You have to use your time to get the shot. You may feel bad. You're going to bear all of the cost, but you're only going to get some of the benefits. You get some of them, but you don't get all of them. And in making decisions, you have an incentive to take into account what are the benefits I'm going to get and what are the costs I'm going to bear. And the fact that, well, you should do this because other people are going to benefit, you can argue, well, morally, that's what you should do. But we're not really talking about what you should do. We're talking about what do people have an incentive to do. And if it's an external benefit, you don't have an incentive to take that into account. And here we see, of course, a graph to demonstrate that. Remember, and as we go through this, think through it because it will help you to understand the basics better. The demand curve always represents the private value or the private benefit. It's the benefit going to the person who's getting the shot, who's paying for it. Okay? And the supply curve shows the private cost. We are saying that when there is a external benefit, the demand curve does not represent the total value going to people in the economy, what they call the social value or the social benefit. Okay? Let's say that you got 500 people. That would be the equilibrium. Let's say the vaccine is $10 per unit. Okay? So we would say the equilibrium is going to be here at 500. Price is going to be $10. What's wrong with, what's not ideal about being there?
Is it because there's so few people getting the flu shot?
It's that would be one way to say it, that not as many people are getting the shots as we would like to get the shot. Okay? Just like with everything, when you decide, well, what's the right quantity? You look at, well, what's the marginal benefit? What's the marginal cost? Okay? To get one more person vaccinated, What's the benefit or value of doing that? And to get one more person vaccinated, what's the cost of that? And we would say for every person with the benefit greater than the cost, we want them to be vaccinated. Okay? And we want to stop at the quantity where the marginal benefit is just equal to the marginal cost. Okay? Now, in our market equilibrium, the benefit to the last person who gets the shot is $10. But we're assuming that for each person who gets the shot, there's a benefit to everybody else who, once you get the shot, you can't give it to somebody else. And it looks here like maybe that gap would be maybe $15. So let's assume there's an external benefit of $15 per shot. So when somebody gets a shot, that person benefits, but other people in the community collectively get a $15 benefit as well. The problem is the consumer says, I'm willing to pay for the benefit I get, but I'm not going to pay for the benefit somebody else is getting. And so that for that 500th person, the benefit to them of getting it is only $10. The benefit to society as a whole is $25. And what's the cost of that 500th person getting the shot? Where do we see the cost? Which curve?
Supply curve?
Cost is always going to be from the supply curve. Okay? So the cost of that 500th unit is $10. The benefit is $25. Okay? And more importantly, for the very next unit, the cost of that very next unit is going to be a little bit more than 10. The benefit is going to be a little bit less than 25. So do we want to spend $10 to get a $25 benefit? Yeah, that's a $15 gain. So we want that 501st person to get the vaccine and the 502nd and third. We want people to continue getting the vaccine until we get out to that point. Because at that point, the marginal benefit and the marginal cost would be equal. Okay? So the efficient quantity is going to be here. Let's say that's 700 people. Okay? We want 700 people to get the vaccine, but without any government intervention, only 500 are going to get it. Okay? And so because we have an external benefit, the end result is that we get underproduction. We would like to have 700 people vaccinated, only 500 are going to get it. And why does that happen? It happens because the consumers are only looking at the private benefit they're getting. They are not looking at the external benefits, everybody else, benefit they're getting when somebody gets a shot. So the problem when you have external benefits is you're going to have underproduction. And where would the inefficiency be represented? What's the problem associated with not having those last 200 people vaccinated? Where would the cost of those last 200, where would the cost be represented? Where do you find cost? Always use the supply curve. So the cost of the 501st person is going to be here. 502nd is going to be here. The total cost of the last 200 units is going to be the area under the supply curve. Okay. Anytime you find the area under a curve, that's giving you the total. So the total cost of producing these last 200 units would be that area in blue. Okay. What is the total benefit of those last 200 vaccinations? Well, that's going to be the area under the social value curve. And so that's going to be...
Is it going to be the red triangle above the blue quadrigram?
That's right.
There's a specific name for it, but I can't. Okay, so it's going to be the whole room.
Right. Well, the blue is what it costs for those last 200 people to be vaccinated. The green is the benefit from having those last 200 vaccinated. So the difference between blue and the green, we'll make that orange, would be, this is the green is the total benefit, the blue is the total cost. So the difference would be this rectangular area. Okay. That would be the net benefit from the last 200 people getting vaccinated. If the government does nothing, those people are not going to be vaccinated. And we're going to lose that potential gain we could have had. Okay. Remember, with external cost, the problem was we got overproduction, too much. And one way to deal with that was to force the producer to take that external cost into account by imposing a tax equal to the amount of the external cost. Well, this is kind of the flip side of that. Here, there's a benefit to society that the consumer is not taking into account. The consumer is not willing to pay for that external benefit. So what potentially could we do to get the consumer to take that benefit into account?
Subsidy?
Use the subsidy. Okay? If the government wants you to do something, well, they can say, if you do this, we'll pay you so many dollars.
If you tax, you get less of. Whenever you subsidize, you get more. That's
right. And so here, when you have an external benefit, you can have a Pigouvian subsidy. Here we see we've already been through this, but we see the dead weight loss. When government does nothing, we get underproduction. We would like to be out. We would like to be out here, but government does nothing. We're going to be back here because consumers aren't willing to pay for the benefit other people are going to get. So if government does nothing, the external benefit means we're going to have a dead weight loss represented by this area. That is the basically lost gains from trade. Benefit we could have had, but we didn't get it because the consumers weren't willing to pay for those extra units. But what we're saying now is, well, this is kind of a summary. When their external benefits from market output is too low. So you can impose a subsidy equal to the external benefit. When consumers are subsidized, then that increases the value to them of consuming the product because they're getting paid. Demand curve shifts up, and it's called a Pigouvian subsidy. And we're going to see that reduces the dead weight loss, increases social surplus. Well, we don't have a graph for that. Let's go back to here. The social we're assuming here that the external benefit, let's say it's, what did I say before? 15. Let's say it's 15. So the vertical distance between the social value curve and the demand curve was 15. How do we get consumers to take it into account? We say, we'll pay you. We'll give you a subsidy. Get the vaccine, we'll give you $15. And so that subsidy shifts the demand curve up. Subsidy shifts the demand curve up so that whereas the demand curve, this was the original demand curve, now with the subsidy, the new demand curve is the same as the social value curve. And so when the demand curve is here, the new equilibrium is here, which means the market outcome is going to be the efficient outcome. So again, just like with the external cost, if you know the amount of the externality, and if it's the same for every person, then you can just impose a subsidy equal to the externality. It solves the problem. In theory, it completely solves the problem because you're going to be here, and if we're there, then we are getting all of this additional gain. Before the subsidy, we didn't get that because these people weren't going to be vaccinated. But with the subsidy, they do get vaccinated. And so our social surplus is going to increase by that amount. Okay? Kind of complicated graphs, but the most important thing, if you have an external cost, then it creates what? Overproduction or underproduction? External cost. It's going to be overproduction. So the solution is to impose a tax that will reduce output, hopefully back to the efficient quantity. If you have external benefits, then the price does not reflect all the benefits. So you're going to have underproduction. So you're trying to increase production, and you can do that through the subsidy. Okay? That's Pigouvian taxes and subsidies are one way that the government can try to deal with externalities, but that's not the only way. Okay. When we talk about internalizing an externality, okay, that simply means trying to do something to get the decision makers to take all of the costs and benefits into account. When you have the tire producer who is polluting and not taking that cost into account, you're trying to figure out how can we get the decision makers to take everything into account. And that's what internalizing means, getting them to take everything into account in making their decisions. Coase theorem, we're just going to touch on for a moment. It's a very interesting idea named after a Nobel Prize winning economist, Ronald Coase. If transactions costs are low and property rights are clearly defined, private bargains will ensure that the market equilibrium is efficient even when there are externalities. Okay? Here's the idea that in theory, even when you have externalities, the market outcome could be efficient. Okay? Think about the pollution. Okay, the tire company is emitting these chemicals into the environment, and it's hurting the people in the community. Okay, the Coase theory says that if property rights are clearly defined, that means if every resource is owned by somebody, and if transactions costs are low, it means it's very easy for people to get together and trade, then efficiency can still be reached even if they're externalities. For example, imagine you've got the tire company, they're polluting the atmosphere. The people in the community, they see this pollution. They know this is hurting them. If property rights are well defined, okay, so that everybody knows who the environment belongs to, okay? Well, if the environment belonged to if the right to a clean environment belonged to the community, then you wouldn't have that pollution. The tire company would have to go to the community and would have to purchase the right to pollute. Okay? So the externality would be taken care of. On the other hand, what if the tire producer, what if he has the right to pollute? The Coase theorem says it's only if he has the right, and if transactions costs are low, then the members of the community can get together, can come to the tire producer and say, look, you're doing something that's imposing a high cost on us. And the cost is greater than the benefit you're getting. So they could negotiate a solution which would lead to that externality being internalized. If there's a clear right to each resource, and if the transaction cost of people getting together and negotiating is low, then you get an efficient use of resources, even when you have an externality. Okay? But go back to our example with the tire producer. The cost of the people in the community getting together, going to the tire producer and negotiating an agreement, those costs are not going to be low. That would be very difficult to do. And it's not likely to happen. Okay, so the Coase theorem said, in theory, the market can deal with externalities, but only if these conditions are met. And so, in many situations, as we said before, the private market is not able to deal with externalities. Okay, government solutions to externality problems. We've already talked about Pigouvian taxes. Say a little bit about command and control policies and about tradable allowances as an option. Command and control. When external costs are significant, that's what we've been talking about before, then the market outcome is greater than the efficient outcome. You get overproduction. Okay? So what can the government do? Well, we've already said they can impose a tax. Okay? But another method is simply for the government to issue a command. You cannot emit any pollution, or you can emit only a certain amount. Okay? And that, if the government says you can't emit any of these chemicals, then those chemicals don't get produced. So that will change the outcome. Okay? But generally, there's going to be a very high cost in doing that. Partially because the government may not have enough information to choose the least costly method of achieving the goal. Okay? The book gives a really good example, interesting example. The generation of electricity contributes to acid rain, which is essentially the kind of pollution we've been talking about. So how to deal with that problem? Okay? One way would be to impose a tax, but what the government has done in 2007, they mandated that appliances become more efficient in a technological sense of using less electricity. And and one of the things they mandated was that all clothes washers had to use 21% less energy. Okay? So across all these different appliances, they're saying, well, for this appliance, you have to cut back by this much. And for this appliance, you have to cut back by this much. Okay? That is one way to reduce the acid rain, okay, by using less energy. Okay? And it's a good example of command and control, because the government is saying, to each producer, you have to cut back by this amount, this percentage, and it's inflexible. Okay? The problem is that there's a very good chance that that's not the most efficient way to cut back on electric production. And they talk about the washing machines, that the price of washing machines has gone up to over, around $1,000 a washing machine. And they don't do a very good job of washing your clothes. And I remember a few years back, and our washing machine went out, and I thought, oh, this is kind of a pain, I have to buy a new washing machine. And I was just shocked to find out how expensive they were. And then to find, well, and they don't work very well. And the reason was because of this command and control policy that was being imposed, telling in each industry, you have to cut back on your electricity consumption by this particular percentage. Well, the problem with that is that, yes, that's one way to reduce electric consumption and acid rain, but there are other ways to do it. If you want total electric consumption to go down by 21%, okay, you could simply figure out, okay, let's impose a tax on electricity. If you impose a tax on electricity, then people are going to use less electricity. And that means that consumers will value buying appliances that don't use as much electricity. So by imposing the tax on electricity, you're creating the right incentives for people to purchase appliances that use less electricity. Okay? Maybe let's see, what would be an example? Let's talk about dishwashers and washing machines. Maybe there's a very easy way to make washing machines, or to make dishwashers much more efficient. Okay? Maybe there's not an easy way to make washing machines more efficient. Okay? If you impose the tax on electricity, then producers and consumers have an incentive to figure out, how are we going to cut back on our use of electricity? And it's possible that you get 40% reduction in electricity by dishwashers, and maybe only 10% cut back by washing machines. Okay? If you use the tax approach, then you can still get the same reduction in pollution, but people it's much more flexible. People get to decide what is the best way to cut back on electricity. Or think about the electric lights. You buy the 60-watt light, but now it's not really 60 watt. Okay? That's one way to cut back on electricity. But if you just impose a higher tax on electricity, then if somebody really, really values, having a lot of light, they can use a lot of electricity on lights, but then they can cut back on other things. Okay? There are lots of ways we can cut back on electricity. You use the tax, then people get to choose which way to cut back. Whereas with the command and control approach, it's not flexible. The government is making that decision for us. All right, a little bit more time. under the command and control method, the government orders firms to produce less. Okay? They're not trying to create incentives for people to change their behavior. The government is deciding, here's the way we're going to deal with this problem, and then forcing people to deal with that. And then the third option, or third government solution, tradable allowances. Under this legislation, the government, which most economists would say this is much preferable to the command and control option, the government decides how much pollution we're going to allow. Okay? So however much reduction we want, okay, that implies a certain amount of pollution we're going to continue to allow. And then the government can issue pollution allowances so that each firm is allowed to emit a certain amount of pollution and no more. Okay? It's a very flexible type policy. The allowances can just be given to firms, or they can be required to buy them. Okay? You can do it either way. Okay? And they are tradable. Okay? So that for any firm to emit pollution, they have to have an allowance that allows them to emit that much pollution. Think about the benefits of a system like this. We can, by altering the amount of allowances issued, we can achieve any reduction in pollution we want. Okay? So it's not a question of we can have a lot of pollution or a little. The government can make that decision, how much pollution to allow. Then they issue that number of allowances to the companies that are doing the polluting. And if you are running a company that's doing a lot of polluting, and let's say your company is emitting 400 units of some chemical per day, okay? And let's say you've been issued allowances which will allow you to emit 200 units per day, okay? So you're emitting twice as much as you're allowed to emit, okay? You have a problem. What are your options?
Trade with somebody who does less polluting.
One option is to, well, let's consider another option first. One option is to say, well, we're doing more than we're allowed, so we're going to have to cut back on the amount that we emit. But to do that, it's going to be costly. You're going to have to change your production processes. So there's a cost there. But with the allowances, you have another option. You say, you go to the market for these tradable allowances, and you can purchase additional allowances from somebody else, from another company, okay? Of course, if they sell those allowances to you, then they can't emit as much, okay? But let's say that there's, your company would find it very costly to reduce pollution, but there's another company that they could reduce pollution at a rather low cost. So companies can, the company that can reduce pollution at a low cost can then trade that allowance to the company that would have difficulty reducing it. And so basically the end result is you can achieve whatever reduction in pollution you want, and you can do it at the lowest possible cost. So it's good for businesses, it's good for society, it's good for consumers, okay? And it's not bad for the environment, because the government can set the total amount of allowed pollution at whatever level is wanted. And Matthew, you were talking about before we started that if, let's say the government said, we're going to allow 10,000 units of something to be emitted in total per day. Well, if you think you're just a private citizen or private group, if you think that's too much and you would like it to be lower, then you could raise money, you could go into that market, and you could purchase allowances for, say, 2,000 units. And you buy those allowances, and then you just tear them up. Okay? The end result, because you bought them, that company would then have to reduce pollution. So if you didn't like the outcome that the government had chosen, then you could raise money and you could buy them up, and that would result in an outcome that would have even less pollution. And it had an interesting chart here. Since 1990, sulfur dioxide emissions have gone down even as we're producing more electricity. So we're able to have more of the goods and services that we want, but at the same time have less pollution. All right, and this is just a summary. In a free market equilibrium, the quantity produced will maximize the gains from trade, consumer surplus and producer surplus. When you have externalities, the market quantity is not the efficient. We talked about these three different types of policies that could be used. Market prices do not correctly signal true costs and benefits when there are externalities. You want to be sure you understand that basic idea. Okay? And then this just summarizes the other things we talked about. Well, we only have 4 minutes. I'll introduce the next chapter, but there won't be anything on the exam for chapter 11. In chapter 11, we start looking at exactly what counts as a cost for a firm. Okay? When you're running a firm, what are the costs that you incur? And exactly what do you have to do in order to make not just some profit, but to make the maximum profit? And what we're going to see is that no matter what kind of firm or industry you're operating in, there are certain basic decisions that every firm has to make. And one is going to be, what is the price we're going to charge? And another is, what is the quantity we're going to produce? And the third is, well, should we produce? Should we go out of business? Or should we not go out of business, but just shut down temporarily? It's very basic decisions. And economics gives us some very clear decision rules as to how a firm should make these decisions. In chapter 11, we are focusing on a market that is highly competitive. By that, we mean a market where you got lots and lots of consumers, lots of producers. Each producer is a very small part of the market. So as a result, each firm says, I am a price taker. Just means each firm says, I have to take the price as given. I don't have any control over the price. I've got to charge the same price as everybody else because I'm a tiny part of the market. That's the kind of thing we'll be getting into chapter 11, but again, that will not be on this exam. So it'll be 8, 9, and 10. Any questions? All right.